The mill stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of town, its broken windows staring blindly into the night, as if it held secrets too heavy to tell, and Emma was about to uncover every last one. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that felt like any other. Emma Carter sat at her kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside her. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the worn wooden surface. She barely noticed the mailman's footsteps retreating down the porch steps, but the envelope caught her eye immediately. It was plain, no return address, and her name was written in a handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in the same familiar hand. "Emma, I need your help. Come to Willow Creek, please. Daniel." Daniel, her brother. The brother who had disappeared without a trace 15 years ago. The brother she had long since given up hope of ever seeing again. Emma's breath hitched. She read the note 3 times, as if the words might change, but they remained the same. Willow Creek. The town they had grown up in, the town she had left behind and never looked back at. Why now? Why after all these years? The drive to Willow Creek was a blur. Emma's mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What could Daniel possibly want after all this time? Why had he disappeared in the first place? And why had he chosen now to reach out? The town hadn't changed much. The same old diner still stood on the corner, its neon sign flickering faintly in the afternoon sun. The park where they used to play was still there, though the swings were rusted and the slide looked like it hadn't been used in years. Emma's chest tightened as she passed the house they had grown up in. It looked smaller than she remembered, the paint peeling and the garden overgrown. She checked into a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place that charged by the hour and smelled faintly of mildew. The room was sparse, but it didn't matter. She wasn't here to stay. She was here to find answers. The next morning, Emma began her search. She started at the diner, hoping someone might remember Daniel. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a name tag that read, Marge, frowned when Emma mentioned his name. Daniel Carter? Yeah, I remember him. Quiet kid, kept to himself. Haven't seen him in years, though. Why? You family? Emma nodded. His sister. He reached out to me, said he needed help. Do you know where he might be? Marge shook her head. Sorry, honey, but if you're looking for answers, you might try the old mill. Folks say strange things happen out there. The old mill. Emma remembered it from her childhood. It had been abandoned even then, a crumbling relic of the town's past. She hadn't thought about it in years, but now it loomed in her mind like a dark shadow. The mill was exactly as she remembered it, a hulking structure of weathered wood and broken windows, surrounded by overgrown grass and twisted trees. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. Emma hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel? She called, her voice echoing in the empty space. Are you here? There was no answer, but as she stepped inside, she noticed something on the floor. A single photograph, faded and torn at the edges. She picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of the two of them, taken when they were kids. They were standing in front of the mill, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. But something was off. In the background, barely visible, was a figure. A man, watching them from the shadows. Emma's stomach churned. She had never noticed him before. As Emma dug deeper, she began to uncover the truth about Daniel's disappearance. It wasn't just a random act of vanishing, it was tied to something darker, something the town had buried long ago. The man in the photograph was just the beginning. There were secrets here, secrets that people had killed to protect. And now, Daniel was caught in the middle of it all. Emma left the mill, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind raced with questions. Who was the man in the picture? Why had he been watching them? And what did any of this have to do with Daniel's disappearance? As she walked back to her car, she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadow of a hat. He was watching her, just like the man in the photograph. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She quickened her pace, but when she glanced back, he was gone. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The motel room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her. She pulled out the photograph again, studying it closely. There was something familiar about the man in the background, something she couldn't quite place. She decided to go through the box of old belongings she had brought with her from her childhood home. Among the faded toys and dusty books, she found a small, leather-bound journal. It was Daniel's. She had forgotten about it until now. The pages were filled with his handwriting, messy and hurried. Most of it was mundane, notes about school, sketches of the mill, lists of things he wanted to do. But near the end, the tone changed. The entries became darker, more frantic. Something's not right. I keep seeing him. He's always watching, always waiting. I don't know what he wants, but I think it has something to do with the mill. I need to find out the truth. Emma's hands shook as she turned the page. The next entry was dated just days before Daniel disappeared. I found something. Something I shouldn't have. I don't know who to trust. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. He's not who he says he is. The final entry was a single sentence, scrawled in shaky handwriting. They're coming for me. The next morning, Emma decided to visit the local sheriff's office. If anyone knew what had happened to Daniel, it would be them. The sheriff, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a thick mustache, greeted her with a polite but wary smile. "Emma Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Haven't seen you in a long time. What brings you back to Willow Creek?" Emma hesitated, then handed him the photograph. "I'm looking for my brother. He reached out to me, said he needed help. Do you know anything about this?" The sheriff's expression darkened as he studied the picture. He handed it back to her, his tone cautious. "Daniel's case was closed a long time ago. He ran away, plain and simple. There's nothing more to it." "Then why did he send me this?" Emma demanded, holding up the photograph. "And who is this man in the background?" "He's been watching us. I think he had something to do with Daniel's disappearance." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Listen, Emma. Some things are better left alone. Willow Creek has a history, and not all of it's pretty. If I were you, I'd let this go." Emma stood her ground. "I'm not leaving until I find out what happened to my brother." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." Emma's next stop was the town's library, a small, dusty building tucked away on a side street. She hoped to find some record of the mill's history, something that might explain why Daniel had been so fixated on it. The librarian, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, greeted her warmly. "Can I help you, dear?" Emma explained what she was looking for, and the man's expression grew somber. "The mill," he murmured. "That place has a dark past. It was shut down decades ago after a series of accidents. People say it's cursed." "Cursed?" Emma repeated, skeptical but intrigued. The old man nodded. "There were rumors of illegal activities, smuggling, maybe even worse. But no one ever proved anything. The owner disappeared, and the mill was abandoned." Emma's pulse quickened. "Do you know who the owner was?" The librarian hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "His name was Victor Grayson. He was a wealthy man, but he kept to himself. Some say he's still out there, watching over the town." Emma's blood ran cold. Victor Grayson. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. She thanked the librarian and left, her mind racing. Back at the motel, Emma spread out the photograph, Daniel's journal, and the notes she had taken at the library. She stared at them, trying to piece together the puzzle. Victor Grayson. The man in the photograph. The mill. It all had to be connected. She flipped through Daniel's journal again, stopping at a page where he had written a single name, Grayson. Beneath it was a sketch of the mill, with an arrow pointing to a hidden room. Emma's heart pounded. She needed to go back to the mill. The mill was even more foreboding at night. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the crumbling walls, and the wind whistled through the broken windows. Emma stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She followed Daniel's sketch, searching for the hidden room. It took her nearly an hour, but she finally found it, a small, concealed door behind a stack of rotting wooden planks. Her hands trembled as she pushed it open. Inside was a room filled with old documents, maps, and photographs. But what caught her eye was a file labeled, Grayson. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. It was a record of illegal activities, smuggling, money laundering, and worse. And at the center of it all was Victor Grayson. But what shocked her most was a photograph tucked inside the file. It was of Grayson, standing with a group of men. And one of those men was the sheriff. Emma's mind reeled. The sheriff had been involved with Grayson. He had lied to her. She needed to confront him, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. She drove to the sheriff's office, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When she walked in, the sheriff looked up, his expression unreadable. "Emma," he said slowly. "What can I do for you?" She slammed the file down on his desk. You knew about Grayson. You knew about the mill. And you knew what happened to Daniel." The sheriff's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emma leaned in, her voice trembling with anger. "Tell me the truth. Where is my brother?" The sheriff stared at Emma for a long moment, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Finally, he sighed and slumped into his chair, running a hand over his face. "You don't understand, Emma," he said, his voice heavy. "It's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me," she demanded, her voice sharp. "Tell me what happened to Daniel." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "Not here. Let's go somewhere private." Emma followed him to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the station. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her. Victor Grayson wasn't just a criminal, the sheriff began. He was something else. Something darker. He had connections, power. People in this town were afraid of him. And he had a way of making people disappear if they crossed him. Emma's stomach churned. What does that have to do with Daniel? The sheriff looked away. Your brother stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. Grayson's operations, the things he was involved in, Daniel found proof. He came to me, thinking I could help. But I couldn't. Grayson owned this town. He owned me. Emma's heart sank. What did you do? The sheriff's voice cracked. I told Grayson. I thought he'd just scare Daniel off, make him drop it. But he didn't. He took him. And I let it happen. Emma's hands clenched into fists. You betrayed him. You betrayed my brother. The sheriff nodded, tears in his eyes. I've lived with that guilt every day since. But it's not over, Emma. Grayson's still out there. And if he finds out you're digging into this, he'll come for you too. Emma left the sheriff's office, her mind reeling. She didn't know whether to feel anger, grief, or fear. But one thing was clear, she couldn't stop now. She had to find Daniel, no matter the cost. As she walked back to her car, she noticed the same figure from before, the man in the hat, standing across the street. This time, he didn't disappear. He stepped into the light, and Emma froze. It was Victor Grayson. He looked older than in the photographs, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and cold. He smiled, a chilling, predatory grin. Emma Carter, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. I've been expecting you. Emma's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. Where's my brother? Grayson chuckled. Daniel was a curious boy. Too curious. But you're just like him. Always asking questions, always digging where you shouldn't. What did you do to him? Emma demanded, her voice shaking. Grayson's smile faded. He's alive. For now. But if you want to see him again, you'll do exactly as I say. Grayson led Emma to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, she found Daniel, bound and bruised but alive. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear and relief. Emma, he whispered. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drag you into this. It's okay, she said, her voice breaking. I'm here now. Grayson stepped forward, holding up a folder. This is what your brother found. Proof of everything I've done. If it gets out, it'll ruin me. But I'm willing to make a deal. Emma glared at him. What kind of deal? You take your brother and leave Willow Creek. Never come back. And in return, I let you both live. Emma hesitated. She wanted nothing more than to take Daniel and run. But she couldn't let Grayson win. Not after everything he'd done. No, she said firmly. I'm not leaving until everyone knows the truth. Grayson's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Before Grayson could react, Emma lunged for the folder, grabbing it and shoving him aside. She untied Daniel as quickly as she could, her hands trembling. We have to go, she said, pulling him to his feet. They ran for the door, but Grayson's men were already closing in. Emma and Daniel fought their way through, using whatever they could find as weapons. They managed to escape into the night, but they knew Grayson wouldn't let them get far. Back at the motel, Emma and Daniel pored over the documents in the folder. They contained everything, proof of Grayson's crimes, names of his accomplices, and even evidence of corruption in the local government. This is it, Daniel said, his voice filled with hope. This is what I was trying to expose. But Grayson found out before I could do anything. Emma nodded. We'll take this to the state police. They'll have to listen. As they prepared to leave Willow Creek, Grayson and his men surrounded the motel. Emma and Daniel barricaded themselves inside, but they knew they couldn't hold out forever. Just as Grayson was about to break in, sirens blared in the distance. The state police had arrived, tipped off by an anonymous call. Grayson and his men were arrested, and the truth about Willow Creek's dark secrets finally came to light. With Grayson behind bars and the town beginning to heal, Emma and Daniel left Willow Creek for good. They knew they could never erase the past, but they had found closure, and each other. As they drove away, Emma glanced at her brother. What now? Daniel smiled. Now we start over. Together.